Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll give it a couple more minutes to let folks trickle in.
Are you coming every week, Glenn? Are you coming every week?
To campus. Just about, yeah.
One more minute and then actually let us begin. Hi, everyone. My name is Ethel Rojas, and I'm the Senior Manager of the Health Equity and Translational Social Science Research Team at the UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine. I'm so happy to welcome Dr. Tiago Puglieri to give us his talk about reimagining scientific inquiry through community engagement in heritage science. Just a little background. Tiago Puglieri is a chemist whose research focuses on indigenous plant-based colorants. His work combines historical and cultural investigations with scientific and technological analyses at the intersection of art, history, cultural heritage conservation, and community engagement. At UCLA, Puglieri teaches and advises students in both the Department of Art History and the UCLA Getty IDP in the conservation of cultural heritage. Before joining UCLA in 2022, he was a professor in Brazil for 7 years. He's held various positions and cooperated with national and international institutions, being a scholar at the Getty Research Institute from 2024 to 2025, a visiting researcher at the Getty Conservation Institute from 2019 to 2020, and the vice president of the National Association of Research in Heritage Science and Technology. So let's all give a warm round welcome to Dr. Puglieri.
Thank you so much, Ethel, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. I would also like to say thank you for Professor Jay, Marisol, and all the other people from the research group. And also a special thanks to Professor Audra Langley, who connected us to start our discussions. So because the audience is very heterogeneous in terms of background, I will have some definitions of some terminologies that I'll be using throughout my talk. And I would like to start, oh, next, please. Sorry. I would like to start discussing the term heritage science, especially for those who are from the health field. So the ICROM says that drawing on diverse humanities, sciences, and engineering disciplines, heritage science is an umbrella term encompassing all forms of scientific inquiry into human works and the combined works of nature and humans that are of value to people. Heritage science focuses on enhancing the understanding, care, sustainable use and management of tangible and intangible heritage to enrich people's lives today and in the future. So we are basically talking about sciences in general and social sciences and humanities as well in the investigation of artworks. So being more precisely, I work within two main domains. The first one is technical art history, and this is why I am, my home department is the Department of Art History in here. And the other one that I work is conservation science, that justify my 50% position at the interdepartmental program in the conservation of cultural heritage. So I was thinking about the diversity of the audience, and the first thing that came to my mind, next one, please, is why am I presenting this here? So what do we have in common that connect me to the hats today to bring my work in here? Next, please. So the hats vision is to create equity-centered patient care models in concert with research that centers social sciences, humanities, and community collaboration. Existing biomedical care systems do not address social determinants of health. In many cases, they construct structural barriers to health, and HETS exists to transform healthcare knowledge and practice. Next. So similar to this, our research group, when we think in our vision, we think to establish equity-driven and Indigenous community-centered research models within technical art history and conservation science. We integrate scientific and artistic historical inquiries with the social sciences and community collaboration, and we develop innovative practices that honors diverse knowledge systems, fosters deeper respect, and ensures mutual benefits that serve both academic progress and the well-being of descendant communities. So with these two visions in mind, next, the thing that we have mostly in common is the development of community-based research. And in such a context, I would like to highlight that this is a very well-developed methodological framework and approach within different disciplines, including and especially in healthcare. However, when we consider conservation science and technical art history, this kind of approach is much more limited. We do not have a considerable number of examples in conservation science and technical art history. So I'm not talking necessarily about the conservation. So when we think in community engagement in heritage science or in a wider perspective that involves conservation, next, it is important to acknowledge previous practices and related experiences that is related to what we are discussing today. So in the field of conservation, the imperative to center descendant communities in the stewardship of cultural heritage is well established. Next. And here we do have a few examples of resources that we have available and have been produced in the context of the conservation of cultural heritage. So we won't be discussing these resources, and many of the people that are online are familiar with these materials. And what I would like to bring here is that although the general recommendations from these resources are applicable to any professional engaging with source communities, including conservation scientists, there is a distinct absence of practical guidance to help the researchers and scientists navigate the transition from laboratory-based or archival inquiry toward a collaborative community-engaged research design. So crucially, existing literature offers little discussion on the unique ethical considerations required when scientific investigations shift from non-Indigenous cultural heritage to Indigenous items. This is particularly evident in the absence of guidelines concerning the complex legal and national and international recommendations for the protection of genetic heritage associated with Indigenous traditional knowledge, Indigenous data sovereignty and governance, and Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights. Next, please. When we think specifically in the context of the intersection of science, indigenous cultural items, and community engagement, we have a very scarce number of publications in the literature. And this is not an exhaustive list of works that have been carried out since the 1980s. But it is very representative of these efforts in the field. So we can see that we have only a few examples in the 80s, in the 90s, and an important one was also developed by Nancy Odegaard in the beginning of 2000s that was published in 2001. And here we do have later other examples that includes works from our colleagues here from UCLA, from our program. So giving this background is really important for me to contextualize everybody in terms of what I am talking about and why I am talking about this here today. Because my main goal with this presentation is to share the work with the colleagues from HEADS to get not only feedback, but also get in the understanding of new approaches and methodologies that could supplement the approaches that we are having in our research. With that said, to continue the presentation, next please. I will be talking about cultural materials and practices in the Brazilian Amazon forest, where I will shortly discuss why it is important or interesting academically for me to investigate and focus on this kind of context. I will move for community-based participatory research, or CBPR. So for those that are not familiar with this kind of approach, mostly from the cultural heritage field, I will also briefly discuss what it is about. And then I will move to the application of the CBPR in the Ticuna Blue case that we have been working with the community from the Brazilian Amazon. And to finish, I will have final considerations and future perspectives. Next, please. So starting with cultural materials and practices in the Brazilian Amazon forest. Next. We do have 6 different biomes in Brazil. And we can see in this map with different colors. And the biggest one that is the light green is the Amazonia biome. And the Amazonia biome is a really important biome in terms of biodiversity, as everybody knows. It has more than 49% of the, comprehends more than 49% of the Brazilian territory. So it's a massive area. And about 60% of this biome is in Brazil, while the other 40% are spread in neighboring countries. And it is home to over 10% of Earth's terrestrial biodiversity. Although we do have all this richness in biodiversity, it's also important to highlight, next, that we do have associated to the Amazon an incredible cultural diversity. So when we think in the Brazilian country, the country of Brazil as an entire area, we do have at about 800 indigenous lands that you can see represented with the red lines in this map. And when we think about only the Brazilian legal Amazon region, we have more than 150 ethnic groups. So this represents really, really immense cultural diversity that is also associated and interconnected with the nature and the biodiversity associated with this biome. Next, please. So in almost like recent publication 2 or 3 years ago, we published this paper specifically to evidence the diversity of plant-based materials that these people have been using. And to highlight the scarce number of scientific investigation that we do have on those materials. So specifically, when we consider plant-based materials, we almost don't have any scientific investigation in the context of the paints production in the Brazilian portion of the Amazon. And most of the works that we do have published, they are related with inorganic materials, mostly ceramics. So among these 150 ethnic groups, next, we do have the Ticuna people. The Ticuna people, they live in the borders of Brazil, Peru, and Colombia, and different terms are used to refer to this community. So we have Ticuna with K and C, Tucuna with K and C, and also the term Maguta. So in this map, we can see the 29 lands that are associated with the Ticuna people in the gray squares, specifically related to the Brazilian territory. So this is not related to the other territories in Peru and Colombia. And they have different cultural activities, including the production of plant-based pigments, as it is shown in one of these images. So they use these natural paints for different purposes, and one of the cultural activities that they do have, next, is the production and decoration of ceremonial masks used for the female initiation rituals. So here we do have a few examples of these masks, and they use almost all the possible colors to decorate these masks with different hues. And some artists, they talk about the production of dozens of paints in terms of highlighting the diversity of biomaterials that they use. So in our work, we started focusing, next please, in the blue produced, or in the blues produced by this community. And from the anthropological literature, we know that they have been using at least these 5 different natural sources to produce blue colorants. The first one is bure or bure, anil, native strawberries, in which we don't have more details, genipapo, and naiku. And naiku is of special interest for us as researchers. Next. Because we do have information from the literature that suggests the engagement with chemical reactions to produce the blue. So this is the fruit of naiku, and it produces violet or purple juice that is also used for the production of violet or purple paint. But in a book from 1952, next please, uh, that was published by the University of California Press, interestingly. And Courtney Moendaju, that was one of the most important researchers in that area. He mentions that the juice of a fleshy fruit, naiku, furnishes a dark violet, which upon contact with iron changes into a clear blue. So of course, as a chemist, my first reaction was that is really fascinating statement, because from the literature we know the chemical composition of the naiku fruit, and knowing from the literature from food science, we know the chemistry of these compounds with metallic ions, and we could hypothesize what we would expect, and that would probably result in some kind of blue colorant that is still unknown for conservation scientists and technical art historians. So I started this work with traditional approaches that we do have in conservation science and technical art history. Next, please. By selecting collections from different museums for the analysis. So I investigated 23 items from the Maguta Museum. That is the first indigenous museum created in Brazil in the 80s, that was created and still maintained by the Ticuna community. The Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology from the University of São Paulo in Brazil, the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology from the Harvard University, and the Fuller Museum here from UCLA. So we collected samples. All the investigation was authorized by representatives of the Ticuna community, as well as the publication of the results. We carried out the analysis using Raman spectroscopy. Next, please. And interestingly, we want to be discussing the results, but what is interesting is that we didn't find any compound related to blue that could be associated with the blue produced through the reaction between NiCu and iron ions. So all these results next were published in a recent paper. But what is important for us in the talk today are two specific observations that resulted in a question for us to proceed with our research in the search of this blue. Next. The first observation is that these items, they are ceremonial, and there are no guidelines for the scientific investigation of indigenous sacred and ceremonial items. And the second observation, next, is that the blue colorant was discovered and has been used by a community that is still living, so they are probably also still producing this material. So these two observations led us to a question, next please, that is, how can we conduct this research in a way that guarantees respect and mutual benefits for all involved? So one of the strategies that we started doing was to write, next please, about the ethics involved in the scientific investigation of this kind of items in a book chapter that is forthcoming, that is being edited by Maria Cocori and Francisca Casadio, entitled Art Objects and the Scientific Method, Global Perspectives and Practices. And I wrote this book chapter with my dear colleague and friend Ellen Purstin, and the title is The Scientific Investigation of Indigenous Sacred and Ceremonial Items, Ethical Considerations and Community Engagement. So we focus on this paper on the ethical considerations, and we introduce different strategies for community engagement for the reader, since we are right now working on a publication that is focused on this kind of frameworks. Next, please. So just for the people from Heritage field that is here today, mostly for you, we are exploring in this chapter 4 different activities. The first one is sampling and destructive analysis. The second one is non-invasive and non-destructive analysis. The third one is publication and dissemination of scientific results. And the fourth one is uses and impacts of the research outcome. We want to be discussing this because it's not the focus of today's presentation, but I will be happy to further discuss these topics. So the other thing that we started doing, next please, is trying to find specific methodological frameworks that have been used in different research fields that could help us proceed or work promoting mutual benefits. So in this context, I'll be talking about community-based participatory research, or CBPR. But next, please. To contextualize that, especially for those that are not familiar with this kind of approach, I would like to briefly talk about the community-engaged research continuum. This was a figure adapted from a book that was written in the field of healthcare. And we do have the last community engagement or involvement on the left and the complete community involvement on the right. And when we think in the traditional research that we do carry out in heritage science or conservation science and technical art history, next please, is the investigator-driven research in which ourselves as scientists, we will define the research questions that we want to answer or the hypotheses that we want to test. We will define what are the methods that we'll be using to test the hypotheses or answer those questions. And we will also be collecting data, doing interpretation, and deciding how to publish and disseminate that knowledge. Next, please. When we consider community-placed research, we are thinking in research that is carried out in the community but not necessarily the research question is of interest to the community. When we move to community-based research next, we do have research in which the research question is of interest to the community. However, the community doesn't have full control and power in terms of defining how the research will be conducted and also disseminated. When we move to the community-based participatory research, or CBPR, we are thinking in a model in which the research questions and hypotheses, they are formulated in collaboration with the community. The community will also have a power sharing in defining the methods that will be used, many times in terms of the interpretation of the results, and also in defining which information can be or cannot be disseminated, and in what kind of platforms for dissemination. Next. CBPR is also known, or related terms to CBPR are, for instance, action research, participatory action research, and street science. So if you are interested, you can look for these other frameworks to find similar approaches. Next, please. So just briefly to define CBPR, we do have different definitions. And this one that I bring to you is from a book about CBPR in archaeology. And it says that CBPR is defined as the systematic creation of knowledge that is done with and for the community for the purpose of addressing a community identified need. Next, please. CBPR has different principles, and in the paper that we are currently writing, we are thinking about what are these principles in the context of conservation science and technical art history. But the things that I would like to highlight for you right now is the mutual benefits aspect and the power sharing aspect of this kind of framework. That involves the full participation of the members of the community in all the process of the research. Next, please. So moving to the application of the CBPR in the Ticuna Blue case that we discussed just before this discussion of CBPR. Next, please. Our main question to keep going with our research was, what are the community-driven research questions for which our competencies and interests in heritage science can be used as a supporting tool, ensuring power sharing and mutual benefits? So rather than centering the research on museums' mission, that is what we usually do for the conservation of cultural heritage, this approach adopts a stakeholder-driven model. So we seek to align scientific expertise with the community's self-identified priorities, fostering a reciprocal relationship that promotes both local agency and scientific innovation. So in this context, next, please. Our main goal to start was to identify the Ticuna's needs and priorities, not only focusing on the preservation of cultural heritage, but try to identify what would be the priorities in the community in general. A second step was to try to identify specifically among the identified needs where we could use our skills to work together and build on their work. So, of course, we were mostly related to the transmission and preservation of traditional knowledge, and with the core of our work currently, that is intercultural education in local schools or in Ticuna schools. So intercultural education is not just the contextualization of Western science in the context of indigenous traditional knowledge or vice versa, but it's a very specific methodology of education that we do have specific experts working with that. So it's a long process that we consider in a long-term project. Next, please. And we were lucky enough because in 2018, there was a PhD thesis that investigated the education of chemistry in Ticuna schools and worked with several teachers from these schools to better understand specific needs related to not only the school, but also with the traditional knowledge. So in this thesis, I highlight in here the need of intercultural and interdisciplinary approaches, equitable pedagogy and social justice, participation in the production of teaching materials, collaboration with elders, and training for the professors, for the teachers. And in this case, our idea was not only to go there, help only with a portion of their needs and leave, but like try to think about long-term strategies that we could work together, even thinking about the sustainability of these actions in the community. So what to do next, please? We identify three specific moments of the project to produce intercultural teaching resources for chemistry and offer training for intercultural education. But of course, that if you want to produce the intercultural materials, we need to have the scientific Western knowledge about their traditional knowledge. And there is mostly where myself as a conservation scientist and technical art historian can collaborate. So in this context, we started doing the scientific analysis at the same time that we started producing resources for training. And now we are continuing our project with the collaborative development of intercultural materials. So next, please. When we think in the scientific investigation, this was our most recent publication that is focused on the scientific investigation or the spectroscopic investigation of the Ticuna blue. We do have three samples that are shown in the slide that were prepared by members of the community. So the purple sample is made only with the juice of naiku, and the blue one is produced when we mix the naiku with iron. And we have two different substrates. One is the tururi, that is the bark cloth that they make for those masks. And the other one is a fiber called tukun that they also use for their arts production. Next, please. So these samples were investigated by different analytical techniques as colorimetry, fiber optics reflectance spectroscopy, SEM-EDX, normal and resonance Raman spectroscopy, micro FTIR, microfade testing, and we also use computational calculations to help us to do the interpretation of vibrational and electronic spectrum. Next, please. When we think in the naiku, this fruit or plant is from the family Zingaiburaceae, genus Renealmia LF. And we do have different examples, and one of them is Renealmia alpina, rod ball mass. Next, please. Which photos we see here. So you can see the plant on the left and the fruits on the right. And from the literature, next, we know that this fruit is really rich in anthocyanins, especially cyanidin 3-O-glucoside and delphinidin 3-O-glucoside. And the chemistry of anthocyanins with metallic ions is very much explored, especially in the context of food science. So the scientific results from our research, next. We won't be discussing the results, but I'll be happy to go back to any of them. All the results from the FORS or the reflectance spectroscopy, they were in fully agreement with observations of the complexation of these anthocyanins, specifically the cyanidin and delphinidin with iron ions that is corroborating with our hypothesis. Next, please. Same thing was observed for the aroma spectra. So we identified different compounds present in the samples, but also defined specific what would be the best conditions for the identification of this kind of pigment in this kind of samples. In addition to confirming that we do have those anthocyanins chelated with the iron ions, the aroma also indicated the presence of polysaccharides that was later confirmed by FTIR. So SEM-EDX, next please, also showed us the presence of iron in the blue paint, but its absence in the control sample of the bark cloth and also on the bark colored only with the juice of Naiko. And finally, the last technique that we used for characterization, next please, was micro FTIR that indicated us not only confirms the presence of pectins, but also indicated the chemical complexation of pectin with iron. So iron would be in the system chelated with both the anthocyanins and the pectins. In the food literature, science literature, we know that this kind of complexation changes some characteristics of the chemistry of these compounds, including stability in some specific contexts. So we also performed microfaging tests. Next, please. That is important specifically in the context of museums to understand the light stability of the colorants in museum environments. So we are not discussing as well the result, but like what this graph shows to us is that both colorants, they are very light sensitive, and the blue one is more light sensitive than the purple. One of the things that we discuss in this paper is also related to the attribution of values to these materials, because usually in the museum field, we focus on materials that are more stable chemically. And this is also related to Western concepts and values that we do have in heritage science. So we also need to take care in terms of attributing values based only in the scientific results. Next, please. So in summary, the ticuna blue is composed of iron ions, anthocyanins, and pectin, and should have complexes similar to those represented in this slide. And next, and one of the very interesting and beautiful parts of this work for me is that the results suggest that the Ticuna people, they were mimicking strategies that the nature does to produce blue colors in flowers, specifically the complexation with metallic ions, because nature used different strategies. So we have been working, next please, with 3 different associations of Ticuna artisans there in the community. And they match, here's a photo of their representatives. They match to propose a specific name for this blue. So they suggested to use the term Ticuna blue. And the continuation of this work, next please, has been to understand with teachers from local schools. So we do have 2 teachers there on the back of this photo from 2 different Ticuna schools that are helping us to understand what are the subjects that they have been using that we could start to work with them and co-produce these materials. And here in this photo, we also have 2 professors from a local campus of the Federal University of Amazonas that are also participating in this project that will also help to guarantee the sustainability of these actions. So in this part of the project, we are basically trying to understand the chemical concepts that can be combined, but this is not the production of intercultural materials for intercultural education, because that would be only contextualization and not using the method of intercultural education. So we are continuing next, please. Our research to work with the community and the associations, together with the Maguta Museum as well, in a project that was the big project that was approved last week. Thanks for the Getty Foundation in their Connecting Art Histories initiatives that will allow us to develop this kind of work, continue to develop this work with the Ticuna community, another community in Brazil, and another community in Mexico. And in addition to the research, this big project is aimed to train a cohort of 9 graduate students to work with science, art, and community engagement in the context of indigenous arts. Together with that, next please. Last summer, we organized the first workshop on intercultural education in Benjamin Constant, where we are working in the area that we are working with the communities. It was a really beautiful surprise for us. We had more than 200 participants in person and online. And the teachers, they produced parts of their materials that they can use in their schools. And we had the participation of at least 5 different ethnic groups, so it was not limited to the Ticuna. And we hope to have this workshop again in the near future. And here we had the participation of more people from the Federal University of Amazonas, special thanks here for Giovanna and Dilane, and Maxine Repeto, that is the specialist or the expert in intercultural education. Next, please. So we are currently finishing to write this paper about CBPR in heritage science, thinking about the adaptations necessary and the specific challenges that we have in our fields, with the proposition of some strategies to overcome these challenges and promote more research with community engagement. This paper is being written by me in collaboration with many people from the community and also from local university. And as final considerations, next, please. Next. I would like to highlight the need to prioritize reciprocity. So shifting from unilateral research to models that provide tangible bilateral benefits for both scientists and indigenous partners. Next. The need to expand our standards, acknowledging that while conservation guidelines exist, conservation science and technical art history require specialized, equity-centered research methodological frameworks. That is what we are doing. Next. The need to transform methodologies, actively decolonizing the production of technical knowledge by honoring diverse ways of knowing. Next. The need of broaden the impact using community engagement as a tool to bridge heritage science with global sustainability goals, thinking not only in environmental sustainability, but also social sustainability. And finally, look beyond our field, that is actively seeking transdisciplinary partnerships to adopt well-established community-based frameworks for the conservation science and technical art history research. That is basically the opportunity that you guys are giving to say what we are doing and think about different frameworks that could supplement the things that we are doing. So finally, my acknowledgements for the opportunity to be talking here today and sharing my work with you guys, the financial support that we have been having, members of the community, the Ticuna community, museums and their staff members, institutes and institutions, and of course my research group and home institutions. Thank you so much. Next one. And I'm happy to answer any questions or hear any feedback and suggestions.
If anybody has questions, feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself. We can also take questions in the room.
Can they hear me?
So we can, these two mics should be.
Oh,
That's okay. It's okay.
Okay, can people online hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Tiago, congratulations on a great presentation and what's unfolding to be a really important research project. It's multifaceted, it's so engaging, and you're actually discovering scientifically, but I think more relevant is that you're taking a step back and putting it in a larger ethical framework. And I'm in your field, so I come from cultural heritage conservation. And it's just really interesting to me that you're starting to look at other fields, including health research, and seeing parallels in the development of participatory community-based research. So I'm curious, on one level, what you're finding in terms of differences between health and cultural heritage conservation. I can see certainly that a lot of health data, it should be kept private, and a lot of spiritual information should be kept private. Maybe I'll just leave it at that and have you respond.
yeah. Thank you, Glenn. So Glenn is one of the biggest names in terms of community engagement and conservation. So just and it's an interesting question in the sense of not only on the ethics, but also in the methodological framework. Because most of the guidelines that we do have in conservation, they are more in the language for conservators and practitioners that are in institutions, and not necessarily they need to be complemented in terms of allowing researchers and scientists to start their own work in terms of having a methodological framework. So I think like from the healthcare, this is super advanced. Like the two main references that I have been using to learn about it, one is from Karen Hacker, that is from healthcare, and the other one is from archaeology from Sonia Atalay, that has a lot of works on these kind of frameworks as well. So I think the main things that we can have from there is understanding these frameworks and how we can use or adapt that framework in terms of the conservation, science, and technical art history. And also, of course, thinking the ethics that are related to these things that you were discussing. But not only in that, in terms of one thing that I think that it is important, or a difference in the healthcare and in the cultural heritage field, and you can correct if I'm wrong, but like my feeling is that in cultural heritage, the community engagement is focused on the mission of the museum. And in the healthcare, they is focused on health, of course, but they are going there to understand what are the priorities of the community, not going there to learn from the community how to best preserve an object. Does it make sense for you? Yeah. So what we are trying to do in our research that is more similar to what they have been doing is trying to understand what are their needs and see how I could, with my skills, work with the community instead of like having it's here was a little bit messy because I started with this work with my own need in understanding the Ticuna blue, but then I started to change the approach when I started to understand how like these other researchers were working. So actually came in contact with them because one of their colleagues was doing a summer school that I was also attending. And because I have been trying to talk with as many people as I can about community engagement and how they have been working with to compare. Yeah. this is why we came here in terms of like this connection. But I'm sure that there are other methods, because when we start like thinking about this interconnectedness with the community, when we think in public health, we have other approaches that start thinking about the social context in addition to the data. So in terms of heritage science and conservation science, when we are doing our work in there, what are other frameworks that we need to consider, not to only explain our data, but also to make that data more useful for the community. So this is one of my main interests like now in trying to learn more about what they are doing and thinking about how we can better use to improve the social impact of the work.
Thank you.
Does it make sense? If
Yeah,
it doesn't make sense, you can just...
Yeah, I mean, I framed it in terms of the privacy of health data and the privacy of spiritual practices. But I think there's another way to look at it, which is what you did, which is starting with community needs and interests and, you know, working to help benefit their needs. So yeah, it's a huge topic.
The privacy, I think it's really similar. But one of the things that I have been thinking a lot that is related to this is that for us scientists, as I struggle to start working with the communities and thinking about the ethics, because we are unfamiliar with that, about the importance of this privacy and the risks associated for the research when you find something in your research that you can't publish. But like these guys in healthcare, like they have been working with these for a long time, but they have training. So I have been also trying to think about like the challenges that we do have in our fields that is related to these specificities that limits the engagement of scientists with the communities, and what could be used to overcome these challenges, like training would be like something really obvious to think about, but that we don't have even to think about like why is it important and what are the risks and how to navigate those risks.
Yeah, thank you. I've got many more questions, but I don't want to.
You know, if we have folks online?
No questions yet.
So Tiago, I first want to apologize for running late. Really appreciate you being here and really enjoyed your talk, at least the second half. I think we have a lot to learn from your framework and the value of like appreciating heritage science. And I think when we do work in health work in community setting, so one thing that I really resonated was like in terms of democratizing and also reciprocity. So in terms of the communities that we work with, I think one of the ongoing challenges is that sometimes we do the work that's supposed to be community engaged, but it's not really fully authentic in terms of who owns the findings. And I think the other thing is like we should be multidisciplinary, right? So our chair is trained in anthropology, but she's an addiction psychiatrist. So thinking about how we learn from our communities, including the indigenous practices they have around health and how we honor that, and instead of like using our Western concept to think like what works for that community when we don't know that community. So really learning intimately from the community perspective, and then also applying the framework that you highlighted. I think there's many opportunities to really, I think there's some synergy and opportunities to kind of learn from each other. And the other thing that kind of reminds me is like kind of recognizing the current climate that we're living in terms of our administration. And I think that the work that you're doing possibly could be, undermined with our current, whatever the administration, right? So I think there needs to be a lot of like ongoing conversation about how we integrate your practice and also in healthcare or equity-centered care, as we put it. So I have a lot of questions, but just wanted to say appreciate your being here, and looking forward to our ongoing conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I mean, so I am actually probably a live document of this collaboration. I have a PhD from Coast in archaeology, and I work at the Panorama Spectrometry Laboratory for the last 6 years here at this building. So, and we have several projects with even that, you know, that kind of promote this interdisciplinary and so, but in addition to that, I have a question about your techniques and methods. So I saw, and actually that's pretty, actually very, congratulations. That's very, very nice work and very nice done. And so you included so many techniques that you used, you know, for these pigments or paint, whatever they. But I didn't see any, you know, a liquid or gas chromatography techniques. So because I mean it's very interesting because I'm working on anthocyanins, but on ancient wine. So you know, from grape, which is like maltodextrin glucosate, which is like very similar to the one that you're working on these pigments. And actually, they have worked very, very well on the liquid chromatography. And in our lab here, so I've been working for the last 3 years on that. And actually I'm working on a paper that having a method that detects these anthocyanins in ancient wines, residues. And I was very interested because you showed that this purple and also reddish pigments. And so because I've done a research on that, and I was curious to see if you've done any of that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So in cultural heritage, usually we start with the non-destructive analysis, and then we move to other techniques as we need. In these specific contexts, they were mostly synthetic materials, and they were very easy to identify with the Rama. In the second study, this paper was mostly to try to identify the spectroscopic fingerprints, because these are the most common techniques available in museums, right? But of course, that 8-PLC liquid chromatography with MS is essential and is probably the most useful technique for the identification of dyes. So the next steps would be to understand the degradation pathways of the ticuna blue, of the anthocyanins, because also when you have the degradation, the signal of Roma, for instance, starts to be covered by luminescence. So it's not useful anymore. Then like chromatography comes to be the natural technique to be used. So the next steps would be in terms of degrading the sample, aging the sample, to see the degradation products that we could identify with chromatography to like characterize older objects. Because since these materials, they are not too stable, in objects from the 18th century, for instance, nowadays you just see the bark and the resin and some inorganic pigment if it is in there. But it's nice to know that you have liquid chromatography.
Sure.
So we are at time. Somebody in the chat said, thank you for your talk and the work you do.
Thank you so much for coming.
Kenda, maybe you know. So I've ended. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Much.
Thank you.